Okay, welcome to the New Jersey Association of Professional Mediators Lunch and Learn webinar for June 25th, 2018, entitled Nobody's Perfect, When a Mediator Second Guesses His or Her Own Performance. My name is R.N.B.C. Jones.
And I'm Joni Jones.
And we're going to be presenting for the next hour. We're going to be taking questions. And I think this is a topic which should be of interest really to everyone who engages in mediation and really in any profession that either does or does not relate to the legal world. I got the idea originally for this seminar when I was attending the 40-hour mediation training last fall. And for those of you who've been through that training, I assume most of you have, if not all of you, there's a lot of role playing which takes place in the course of the training. And I'm a retired judge, and before that, for many years, I was a practicing attorney for many years, and now I'm a mediator and arbitrator. So I've worn all different hats during the course of my career. So I had a fair amount of experience with mediation before going into the mediation training. But a lot of the others did not, and they came from all walks of life. Some were from a legal background, attorneys and such. Some were not from legal backgrounds. But there seemed to be, to me, a common denominator in some concerns and almost to some degree panic that a lot of people had when they were doing the role playing the role of a mediator, that they were concerned that they did a bad job, they didn't say the right thing, what they did say, what they didn't say, they were second guessing themselves, which of course you're supposed to ask questions during the course of the presentation and during the training. However, on the ride home, it dawned on me that this is something which probably should warrant a seminar of its own, concentrating on the fact, on the human element of being a mediator, that nobody is perfect, and what happens when a mediator second guesses his or her own performance. I went home and talked to my wife about it, who's been a mental health nurse for many, many years in the field, and she presents on this subject, and we talked about it as far as whether this would be a meaningful type of seminar. And we both agreed it would. We presented it to the good folks at New Jersey APM, and so here we are. Joni, you want to tell a little bit about yourself?
Well, like Larry said, I am a registered nurse. I'm board certified in mental health nursing. I also am a certified anger management specialist, published author, and national speaker. And I facilitate a lot of groups, and I help individuals with certain, challenges. And perfectionism happens to be a very big challenge for many people.
Well, talking about perfectionism, because I really think, in my own experience and observations, this is a major problem in the profession, with law clerks, attorneys, judges even, mediators, and we're talking primarily about mediators today, but it really engulfs all walks of life. What would you say are some of the major problems with perfectionism that the people listening today should be aware of in your experience?
Well, first of all, I find a lot of people have difficulty with recognizing there's a challenge in the first place. Just part of human behavior is that we develop habits. We develop habits through life, and we're basically on autopilot. We may become very impulsive or very reactionary, and during the course of the moment, we're not even aware of things that are happening to us until we go home, and all that chaotic stuff that's going on, it kind of settles down, whether we are watching television or taking a shower or just relaxing at the dinner table. We start to have all these thoughts that go through our minds.
So specifically with the role of a mediator, what it always seemed to me was a mediator is being asked to problem solve. A mediator is being asked to come into a case, whether it's a civil case, a family law case. Very often these cases have a history to them of contentiousness. Sometimes it's not even the issue itself. It's just the dynamic between the parties who are the plaintiff and defendant, or if they're not yet in court, who are just opposing, have opposing positions. And they expect you as a mediator to help them solve their problems. But very often you're unable to do so, at least not immediately, or you don't get the immediate results that you want. Joni, do you find that sometimes when the mediator doesn't get an absolute perfect result or doesn't settle a case, that this can cause a problem for them in terms of their mental health?
Well, I think like when they go home and they start second guessing themselves on what kind of, job they did, or, if they didn't please one and they may have pleased another, like all these thoughts are going through their minds that are creating stress and anxiety. And stress and anxiety, if you ask me, is the #1 killer, because it exacerbates everything else in your life, not in a positive way, but in a negative way.
So the role of a mediator, and I mentioned law clerks before. In my experience, I hired many law clerks And when they came in, they were fresh out of law school. They hadn't really been in the field. And sometimes they're asked to mediate cases at the court, as some of you may know, small claims cases, special civil part cases, whatever the case may be. And then when they go out and they pass the bar and they go into the field, sometimes they become ESP panelists, mediators in family, court, civil, whatever the case may be. But in my experience, there was an awful amount of self-imposed stress being put on themselves if they didn't get an immediate result, as if they had to be Superman or Supergirl, as the case may be, and solve all the world's problems. And I would tell them, you know, you have to understand up front, in the course of a legal career or the course of a career as a mediator or in any other walk of life, you have to assume right up front, number one, you're not going to settle every case. And number two, if you don't settle a case, it doesn't necessarily mean it's because of you. You could bring in Abraham Lincoln to try to settle a case and he might not be able to do it. Sometimes the dynamic of the parties is such that no matter what you do, you aren't able to resolve it, and it doesn't necessarily reflect poorly on you. Nonetheless, people do go home and they carry it with them, and they have what's called self-talk. And Joni, you've spoken a lot about self-talk in different seminars. What is self-talk?
Well, self-talk is that inner voice that we all have inside of us. It's really our thoughts. But I do want to bring up one thing, and that is that everybody understands that we're not born with knowledge. We're born with the ability to think. So we really are a product of who our role models have been in our lives and what experiences we may or may not have. If we've never been shown something, then we can't possibly know about it. And in the self-talk, like there's some things that we'll react to, especially when we're talking about stress and anxiety, over things that we don't have control of. And one of the vital things that I have learned is to look at what I do have control of and what I don't. Because when I refer to that impulsivity or that becoming very reactionary, it's because when we're on that autopilot, we're not mindful or aware of any type of trigger or, you know, mood change that we might have. And if we push that pause button, it gives us that heightened awareness. And once we're aware of what we're responding to, it gives us just a little bit of that time of maybe saying things or doing things that we may regret, later on. And one of the things about self-talk is we always have control over that self-talk. We just have to learn the skills on how to manage it. We don't have control of other people, and triggers in life are going to be there all the time. And, but with that self-talk, we can reframe. So if we're thinking negatively, we can reframe that into positive thoughts, because, if you change the way you think, you change the way you feel, and you change the way you respond. And the same way as if you change the way you feel. So if you're feeling very upset or angry, your thoughts are probably going to be negative. So if you change the way you feel and you change the way you think, you also change the way that you respond.
So let's say you have a mediator who's been in an all-day mediation, been very tough. People, both sides have been upset. They've been yelling or whatever. It hasn't really worked out that well. The mediator goes home ready to basically, sulk in depression over how things went. What would you recommend? There's some tools, constructive tools, that mediator can utilize to move beyond that and move on to the next day.
Well, I think it's very important that we write things down, and because there's so much going on in our mind, and it can become perseverative where we're thinking about things over and over again, and we can get different racing thoughts that become very interfering. And if we fall prey to that, we just go further and further into a hole. So we can learn how to just stop and distract and write those things down, because some people aren't aware of certain things that they don't have control of. And one example I'll talk about is transference. So when you're talking about transference and somebody reminds you of somebody, with that, if you had a good relationship with them, you may respond more positively with them. But if you didn't have a good relationship with them, you might not respond so positively to them. And also, when we talk about if somebody, for instance, had a problem with alcohol and you had an unresolved conflict of alcohol in your life, or there was domestic violence and you have known somebody or been involved with that you have an unresolved conflict with that. Unconsciously, you can be taking it out on that particular person because you have your unresolved conflicts. And that's when we talk about looking at mindful or heartfelt forgiveness. And that's different than forgiveness.
Okay. Now, what I noticed in a lot of my speaking with not only mediators, but attorneys and judges, a very common a problem which is stated is people saying that they felt impulsively that they said something they shouldn't have said, meaning the mediator or the attorney, sometimes the judge, to a party, got them upset, that they were triggered or pushed into saying something, that they should have bit their tongue, and then they regret the words that came out of their mouth because someone took it the wrong way, etc., etc. And in my experience, I used to hear this all the time from different people in the profession. Joni, what's your view on when somebody states that they were triggered to say something and then they have all these regrets after the fact?
Well, first of all, the past is the past. And moving forward, we can look at some of the reasons why those things were said and what was so bothersome about it. So for instance, if you say something and then it triggers a response where now people are arguing. And, to get back control of that argument, it really comes through effective communication. And again, it's nothing personal, but if we've never been shown effective communication, then we're not going to know really about effective communication. So we can turn around and, first of all, become effective listeners, because so many people, they're not effective listeners because they're busy thinking about their own thoughts when something is happening. But I know for myself, when somebody starts getting very loud, nobody can tell you how to feel because feelings are neither right nor wrong. So I may say, it's nothing personal, but when people get loud, I really can't hear what you're saying. And I really would like to hear what you have to say. Let's take, a 5-minute break and let's go back and let's revisit it. So you're kind of setting the boundaries and the limits, and you're showing the person that you care, that you really do want to listen. And that's part of effective communication.
Sometimes when people get loud in mediation, when one of the litigants, they get loud or perhaps overly aggressive, it's not necessarily because the mediator has said something wrong. And while mediators or any human being could get self-defensive and start second guess themselves as far as whether they force somebody to react, very, very hostily towards them. The fact of the matter is, in the context of a mediation, sometimes people will yell because they're naturally over-aggressive people. And sometimes it's being done very deliberately to try to, as a strategy, to try to control what the mediator is going to do or say. It's almost like in baseball, when an umpire makes a call, a manager runs out and argues the call, even if the manager knows that the call may have been correct. It's a strategy to try to influence the umpire for the next call. So just keep in the back of your mind that if a litigant is getting belligerent, if they're getting hostile, if they're getting angry towards you, it may be because they're trying to control what the ultimate outcome will be. Sometimes people can get controlling that way. So it's not necessarily because you have done something wrong. And if you know that you've said something wrong, as the title of the seminar is Nobody's Perfect. We all have said things in walks of life that we have regretted having said. If it's something that's really bad, an apology is always the best way to go. It doesn't necessarily change what was said, but it certainly helps when appropriate. But if you've said something and it was something you shouldn't have said, to perseverate on it, to lose sleep over it, to think about it over and over again to the point of beating yourself over the head is, in my opinion, in my experience, really pointless. The more constructive way to deal with it is to learn from that experience and just be alert to it so that the same types of statements are not made again in the future. And this is the type of thing I would try to go over with law clerks sometimes when they were going into the field, when they were getting ready to leave the clerkship and go into the practice of law. And a lot of them, because I was a family court judge, they naturally went into family court. Most of my clerks did, as a matter of fact. And so I would always have a conversation with them before they left about, some of the do's and don'ts when you go into the field. And because when you're in family court, you tend to do a lot of mediation for other cases. That's what tends to happen, as well as in civil. It's important to know these types of things. And it's also important to be alert to the fact that we're all going to say things that we, regret later on, but don't let that be something which then affects your ability to be a neutral mediator, meaning trying to, as Joni said before, to people please, to try to say, well, we have to please this one because he's going to be mad at me, or this one because she's going to be mad at me. Because if you do that, you're going to lose your own effectiveness as a neutral mediator, and you lose potentially the not only the outcome of the case, but the respect of both of the parties who depend on you to help problem solve as a strong neutral mediator. Joni, you agree?
Well, one of the things that you brought up is people pleasing, and I think that's very important because so many people that I speak to, are people pleasers, and they recognize that as a challenge. But then it's going back and looking at the facts. And if you agree that everybody is different, no two people are exactly the same, then how can you possibly please everybody? And on top of that, we have our powers within ourselves. And if we're giving other people the power to make us feel good, aren't we giving them the power to also make us feel bad? So if we're not pleasing them, then we go home and we're like, gee, we're focusing on that one thing instead of all the good things that we did. We're focused on that because we're, people pleasers. But if you recognize the fact that it's really impossible to please everybody, then what does that come back to? It comes back to us and pleasing ourselves. And being able to learn how to be okay with ourselves, regardless of what the triggers and the responses are. So it's not saying that you're great and wonderful. It's not saying that you're perfect. It's just saying that, you're particularly okay with that. So when you are mindful or aware that this is going on and you know that this is a challenge, you kind of push that pause button, and in your own thoughts, you can turn it around and say, you know what? I would like to please everybody, but I know that it's impossible. Everybody's different. And you know what? That's okay.
And the job of a mediator is truly not to be anyone's friend. It's to help them resolve a case. And everyone who's been through the training or who's observed other mediators knows that different mediators have different styles. Some take a very friendly approach. And sometimes when they take that approach, they end up, at least on the surface, it appears that they're befriending one or both sides. However, others take a more aggressive approach, and it depends on the nature of the case and, of course, the nature of the mediator. If you go in with a mindset that you have to become the friend of either or both sides, it can be very, very, very detrimental. And on top of that, if you end up being too friendly with one side, the other side may read it the wrong way and may basically take everything that you have to say and say, well, you're just siding with the other side. So you always have to maintain a degree of neutrality and not attempt to be overly friendly with either side in these types of cases. We're going to pause for a minute and see if there are any questions at this particular point. We'll be taking questions throughout. Let's see what we have. Let's see. Let's see. This is a question that says from Bruce. It says, longtime labor management, dispute resolution professional, currently teaching negotiation and LMR at Kane University. Perfectionism is interesting. Makes me think about how we variously define mediation, strictly impartial facilitator, or the more evaluative and directive styles. I'm not sure if there's a question in there as much as a comment, but okay.
I'd like to get into the heartfelt forgiveness and the frame of references, because I find that this happens so many times with individuals, because we have our own definition of what forgiveness is. And forgiveness really becomes that, in our definition, that we're saying whatever somebody did to us is okay. And also that now we can rebuild a relationship with that. And that's the basic definition of forgiveness as we know it. But there's something that's called heartfelt forgiveness. And in heartfelt forgiveness, we're really not looking at it logically. We're looking at it within our heart. And our definition to it is that we do not have to say that what the person did to us was okay. And we're not saying that now we have to build a relationship with them. And we see this through people who have had, for example, their child murdered, and they go into court and they say, I forgive you. And the reason for that is that they're not living with the torment of the effects of what that individual did the rest of their lives, because then their adrenal glands are going to respond. They're going to have that chemical reaction where they have their blood pressure going up, their heart rate going up, you know, their stress and anxiety levels are going up, and they're caught over something that they don't have control of. And when I was getting back to earlier, when I was talking about this unconscious response of transference, when you have this, you know, this heartfelt forgiveness, you are forgiving those things that have happened to your life, so you're not projecting onto somebody else the ongoing effects that you're having, and you're forgiving them, so it frees you from being, you know, tormented. And the definition is, you're not saying that it's okay what they did, and the definition is not saying now that you have to develop an ongoing relationship with them.
In terms of recovering and moving on from a negative personal experience in mediation, this was one of the bullet points we had in the flyer that went out relating to this seminar. And this, you know, in my history and my experience, tends to be an issue with some mediators as well, that they just can't let go of the one where they feel they really messed up. Sometimes they're talking about a case that was from 6 months ago or a year ago or even longer. And it's clearly, as an outside observer, to me, it seems that it affects their ability to really be an effective mediator, effective professional in future cases. And so when you carry with you, let's say you had a bad experience, let's say you really did mess up, or you feel you messed up. You did something, it wasn't very good. You second guessed your own performance, quote unquote. That happens. And then the question is, what do you do with that? Do you let it eat you alive, or do you move ahead from that? And I've talked to lots of different mediators about this, and lots of other people both in the mental health field as well as in the legal profession. And the ones who seem to have had the best experience moving ahead are those who are able to say, look, I'm allowing myself to make mistakes, to have bad days. Everyone has bad days in every profession. And to put it on the shelf and immediately move on to the next case and try to do as good a job as you can in the next case, and the one after that, and the one after that. So if you have 30 cases and 28 of them are really to your satisfaction and 2 of them aren't, you don't let those 2 destroy your performance in the other 28, because nobody is perfect. And we know this in all walks of life, Joni.
Well, you know, you bring up a very good point, because when I ask people, do people make mistakes? And they say yes. And I say, well, that means you too. And then they look at it and they're like, yeah. And then I'm like, well, why are you setting yourself up to fail? Because that's really basically what you're doing. But again, our self-talk becomes our biggest coping mechanism, because I can ask a room full of people, how many people here have made mistakes? How many people have hurt people they loved? You know, how many people have things in their closet that they're not proud of? Every single hand goes up. What we do have control of is we could either take our energy and feed into the past and feed into all those mistakes that we made, or we can say, hey, you know what? Yep, I've made my mistakes, but you know what? Every experience that I've gone through in my life, everything that I've done, it made me who I am today. And I'm okay with who I am. Again, I'm not great and wonderful. I'm not perfect, but I am okay with that.
It may also be that you are over-exaggerating how poorly you feel you may have done. You know, they know this with juries. You could, if you had 12 people look at your performance in a videotaped mediation, you may find that they have radically different independent views on how you did. You don't always have that opportunity. You have it to some degree in the training programs, but you don't have that in real life, but it's the truth. You could ask multiple people, how was this mediator? And some will say fantastic, and some will say terrible. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's because you were terrible or fantastic. It could be all kinds of other thought processes which go into somebody's opinion. And they have different views of things. So, you know, people are usually their own worst critics. And it happens with mediators as well. So it may well be that all of the self-doubt that you're putting upon yourself may not be warranted based upon how you actually did. See, there are a couple more questions here. There's one from Bruce saying, can you speak to how you define mediation? Considering your background and work history, do you use evaluative and directive comments with disputants, or do you try to maintain an impartial and facilitative style? That question, it's not really directly on target with what we're talking about in the seminar today, but nonetheless, I think it's a relevant question. Mediation really is an attempt to, in a confidential manner, meaning off the record, try to facilitate a mutually acceptable resolution between two parties who are unable to do it on their own up until that particular point in time. The very nature of mediation, which does tie into this seminar, is that there's no one set way to go about doing it. When I was in the training program, people were asking for scripts, I remember. They were saying, what should I ask? Is this the right way to do it? Some litigant or some participants in the program were saying, well, different instructors have different strategies, different ways to go about things, which is all 100% true. And that's the beauty of mediation, and why it's silly, quite frankly, in many instances, for a mediator to beat themselves over the head as to how they handled something, because there is no one right way to do it. It depends on your own style. It depends on your own personality. It absolutely depends on the particular people in front of you. If you have two reasonable people in front of you, it's much easier to take a more friendly approach than if they are very hostile or contentious, or they're not listening to anyone, including you or anyone else. Then it becomes a much more different dynamic to try to reach a result. With reference to the question in terms of an impartial and facilitative style, generally, a mediation is supposed to be impartial, obviously, by the very nature of mediation. The mediator doesn't represent either side. And it's supposed to facilitate, the goal is to facilitate a situation where they're this far apart and then they come this closer apart, and then finally they reach an agreement through consensus, compromise, and flexibility. However, sometimes, and this was something which was discussed actually in the mediation, in some various mediation seminars, whether the mediator can make recommendations based upon their history, things of that nature. And everyone has a different view on that. In my view, I think it is appropriate for a mediator to make certain recommendations, as long as it's couched in a way that this is what I think might be helpful based on my experience. This I think might be productive. You're not telling the parties what to do, but you are basically giving some of your advice from your past experience, from your past work as a mediator, from your past involvement in the court system, if you have prior involvement in the court system, or whatever walk of life you're from, to help them reach a facilitated compromise agreement. Joni?
And Bruce, I think with your question, with the definition of, perfect practice versus mistakes, we've already come to the conclusion that, people make mistakes, people make the world go round, there's no idealistic world, so there's not really a perfect practice, and we all make mistakes. However, it's when we think about those mistakes and become like perseverative, or it becomes like in control of our emotions instead of our emotions being, in control of us. So we want to control the emotions. So once we start thinking, oh my goodness, I made a mistake. How can I learn about that mistake? How can I research it? How can I improve upon it? Instead, it becomes very perseverative, and it's interfering with you enjoying other things in your life. So that's the difference between, being a perfectionist, where it becomes interfering, and then just taking a mistake and learning from it. But we have another question, Larry.
Yes.
And it's asking, if you think that it's beneficial that there's a co-mediator model.
Yeah, this is from Andrew, and the question is, do you ever use a co-mediator model, and how would that work for self-feedback? I've used co-mediator models in the past, not anytime recently, I have to say, due to kind of the nature of my work, but I'm not adverse to using it. I think it can be very helpful, especially for newer mediators, because newer mediators, quite frankly, are the ones, in my opinion, that are more likely to take the approach, if things don't go as well as they had hoped, that they want to bail, that they want to quit, that they're too much of a perfectionist, that they don't want to give it a shot, that they're not cut out to be a mediator. And it's really not true. Pretty much anybody who has any degree of discipline, patience, intelligence, and wanting to help people can be an effective mediator, quite frankly, if they just, don't be too hard on themselves. So using a co-mediator model, if you have two people, and the co-mediator model can be in a couple different ways, meaning using more than one mediator, two mediators. In some instances, you have a more veteran mediator kind of running the show, and then the more of a novice mediator watching and learning. You can have the reverse of that, where the novice mediator, the one with less experience, is running the show, and the veteran mediator is just sitting back watching in order to give constructive feedback to the mediator after the fact, which I think can be really helpful to a new mediator, because not only are they learning by getting their feet wet and actually doing instead of just watching, massive difference between doing and watching, but then you're getting the feedback from a mediator. And then in other cases, you see this quite a bit in certain counties when they do matrimonial ESPs, early settlement panels, which are similar to mediations, although not exactly the same thing, where they pair you and you have two people basically serving as mediators. Now, you got to be careful in that situation that the mediators don't end up contradicting each other and fighting with each other in front of the litigants, because that's not helpful. And that happens sometimes. But very often, experienced co-mediators will learn how to do that and play off of each other very well in a constructive way to hammer home some points that might not be as acceptable perhaps to certain litigants if they're only hearing it from one person as opposed to hearing it from two people, as long as this is their genuine view of things. But I think having a co-mediator model can be very, very helpful in a case where somebody is having doubts about their own performance. And so if you are one of those mediators who is having some doubts about your own performance, looking into serving as a co-mediator, either taking the lead role or the back role or a co-role, a pure co-role, can be very helpful. And other things can be helpful too, that not to say everything, counseling is the answer to everything, but sometimes if your thoughts are such where you really are having second doubts, self-doubts and second thoughts about whether you're cut out to be a mediator, going and speaking about it with a counselor in a professional setting, in a confidential setting, cannot hurt. And can obviously be very helpful in a lot of instances. Joni?
Yeah, there's two comments I'd like to add. And again, if we look at your self-talk or that inner voice, those thoughts that you are having, if you're saying, I can't, this is too hard, then if that's what you're thinking, that's the way you're going to feel, and that's going to be the way that you respond to things. So if half the room says they can't and half the room says they can, they're both probably right. So if you're aware of that, you can reframe those thoughts and you can say, hey, you know what? I'm capable of learning. It may not be immediate results, but I am capable of learning and I can do this. So that again has you becoming aware of your emotions and then being able to control them. The other thing is sometimes there's an underlying fear, and that fear can be a fear of rejection. It can be a fear of failure. And those things get in the way, with our self-esteem. And then there's other things that we can research and we can learn about how to manage those things.
What do you think, Joni, in the field, sometimes job-related stress can have a very, very detrimental effect on quality of life issues, et cetera. What can people do? Say they're practicing mediation, they're feeling very stressed, they're feeling overwhelmed, they're feeling like they're not getting the type of results that they would have hoped for. What can they do to kind of just ease down a little bit?
First of all, there's several things. Number one, if you're looking for something immediate, if we can go back into our childhood when we were blowing bubbles, and I ask people this question, and many people, they say they had such a great experience and had a lot of fun blowing bubbles. And I said, well, there's really a physiological response to that, because in our autonomic nervous system, which is that adrenal gland response, people might hear of it as a fight or flight response. It shows us when there's a threat or a danger, and that activates all this response in our body that I mentioned before about our blood pressure, our heart rate, all of that going on. But we also have something which is our parasympathetic nervous system, and we have a vagus nerve in our brain that actually causes a calming effect. So for my people who have panic attacks, for instance, their breathing will be more with their chest. If we, like blowing bubbles, push out on our outer abdomen and we breathe in that fashion, we're actually stimulating that vagus nerve that is doing something that is promoting a calming. That is an immediate reaction, that nobody can even know that you're doing such a thing. So that's one thing that we can do if we need to react in that way. The second thing is, I ask so many people, we have so many obligations in our life, and again, we're on autopilot. What do you do for joy? And a lot of people, they've taken joy out of their life. Well, if you look at a balloon and you can put so much air in that balloon before it pops, for us, Maybe we were fortunate that we've gone on vacations, and those vacations really have allowed us to let some of that air come out of our balloon so we can face the everyday stresses that we have when we go to our job and, you know, what happens in our personal lives. So joy is different for everybody, but what we need to do is really take the time to define joy, what it means to us, and then we have to incorporate that into our repertoire. So that's another thing. So many people, they don't really look at the value of taking time off and incorporating that joy. So that's another thing. But one of the most important things, we want to start our day with our stress and our anxiety levels as low as we possibly can, so that when we are having those, you know, triggers throughout the day that are causing all these thoughts and these unhealthy reactions in us, it's very simple. So if we're looking at keeping our stress and our anxiety down, and, you know, just so you know the difference, the stress are the triggers, and you can, the anxiety is the response to those triggers. So you could take away those triggers and the anxiety still remains present. So you have your stress and your anxiety. Then you have how much sleep are you getting? So you need to know how much sleep your body needs and make sure that you get that. Same thing with hunger. You know, there are glucose instabilities that happen within us when we're skipping meals. And sometimes it's a matter of drinking something or having a power bar with us or something just to keep us eating. And I think they have a term now called hangry, and it is research. So any underlying medical condition, whether it's high blood pressure, thyroid, you know, even any of your, you know, psychological disorders, all of those, pain management, all those be, you know, managed effectively. And then of course you want to keep alcohol to a moderation, and then try to stay away from street drugs. And also sometimes when you are prescribed drugs, it's very important to look at the adverse reactions to that. So if you can keep that in your balance and check them off and make sure all those things are there, you're going to start your day with a less of a stress, you know, rate that will help you, you know, really face whatever things that you're facing during the day, whether it's work or anything else.
Yeah, it's really important to have a balance. And I know, and Joni's a witness to this, because in the early years of our marriage, I was, I guess you could describe as a workaholic, as an attorney. And when we would go away on vacation, I'd bring a whole bunch of work along with me, right? And she would say, what are you bringing all of this along for? Like your ball and chain. But I felt I had to do it, you know, because I had time, and then I'd be able to work on people's cases. And again, it was to some degree, I guess, an element of trying to be a perfectionist at that particular time. And quite frankly, in retrospect, it was very detrimental. It was, because the whole point of a vacation, the whole reason you have vacations, the whole reason you have weekends in the first place, is to refresh and replenish and rejuvenate. That is the entire purpose of it. So with enough of Joni's prodding, I stopped taking the stuff along. And really, when you get back, you really don't miss a beat. Yes, when you come back, you may have a pile of papers you have to handle, but you get through that very quickly, usually, by just going back to your normal routine. It's become harder now, because when you go away, you're not really away between emails and text messages and everything. You're always available, no matter where you are. You could be out in the Pacific Ocean and you're still reachable, if you're going to be reachable. But if you know, as a mediator, some mediators I know that they make themselves perhaps overly available to parties to demonstrate, again, people pleasing, or to demonstrate you're there for them. But then when you do that, you are potentially for the goal of perfectionism. Perhaps doing something that's not in your own best interest, because if you're constantly being bombarded with demands from people who you're trying to serve as a professional on your professional time during your personal time, it just has to have an effect on you and your family and your own well-being. There have to be certain boundaries which are set. When I was in the practice of law, before I was appointed to the bench, and it was before really you had texts and emails. You had emails, but they weren't as prevalent as they are now. You didn't have smartphones at the time, iPhones and stuff like that. But I did not like to give out my email address at the time, because I felt that was now going to encroach into the personal time, and you're going to get bombarded Now, I know it's a different world today, and sometimes you have to do that. And if you don't, you don't give your email address, it could be a problem. The client can't reach you. What if it's an emergency, et cetera? So you always have to consider those things. But the reality is, even in today's world, if I'm involved with a mediation, which is taking multiple sessions, which happens sometimes, while they can contact me, I make it clear right from the beginning that that is for emergencies or if something comes up that is extremely time sensitive only. And if somebody violates that or goes over that, whether it's a pro se litigant or an attorney representing a party, I make sure to remind them of that, even though I might politely answer saying, okay, we can do this, but I'm away right now. If it's not an emergency, we'll deal with it when I get back. Because you have to set some boundaries. You have to set some ground rules. You're not owned by anybody. You're not owned by the litigants. And if you try to be too much of a perfectionist, a people pleaser, and make yourself completely available at every minute, it's probably not going to work out to your advantage and may well affect your ability to in a healthy manner, attend to what you have to do as a balanced mediator. Joni, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's a couple of things that I just wanted to make a comment on. Getting back to when you're laying down at night and you have these perceptive thoughts and these thoughts going over and over and over again. There's a lot of people that I run into that have an underlying obsessive compulsive component to them. And so many times when those thoughts become perseverative like that, they're looking for a solution. And what we really want to do is we want to get control of the behavior. So if you're aware that these thoughts are going over and over and over in your head, push that pause button and distract. Don't try to find the solution at that time, because if you're trying to find the solution, then what you're doing is you're just feeding more into that obsession. So what we want to do is first work on changing that behavior. So that's number one. Number two, so many times when I talk about in coping mechanisms, sometimes we need skill development. And another skill development besides effective communication, may be the identification of emotions. And I see this a lot in cultures, and I see this a lot in the male gender. Like, for instance, when men were growing up, if something made them upset, they were told that they were a sissy if they cried. And as they got older, if they had any type of emotional responses, then it became that they were imbalanced or unstable. And a lot of things come out as anger when there's really like this underlying hurt or disappointment. So if we can learn the feeling that's associated with the emotion of what you may be feeling at a particular time, again, it will go back to what you have control of, which is your self-talk or your thoughts. And you could say, hey, look, I've been frustrated before and I've gotten through it again. I can get through it now. I've been disappointed before, but you know what? I'll get through it again. So that's how you start to take that control. But if you feed into those underlying things where you might feel sad or disappointed or frustrated, whatever that emotion may be, you can spiral. And that's when your emotions become in control of you.
Right. We're going into the last 15 minutes of the presentation. And so as we move towards the conclusions, if there are any other questions, please send them in and we'll try to answer them time permitting. One of my favorite stories in my own life occurred, it was about 1 or 2 years after I had been appointed to the bench, and I was at a bar dinner. I don't remember what the subject was, but if anyone who's ever been to a bar dinner, the attorneys come up and the judges come, and it's basically this dinner, some presentation, and it's just kind of a social thing. So an attorney came up to me, and he was really upset, and he said he wanted to talk to me because it was bothering him. He was a younger attorney who had also worked as a mediator very often, and he said that he felt so badly about what he had said when he was up in front of the court, that he was losing sleep over it. He wanted to apologize, and it was the first chance he had to see me off the bench since that incident happened, the incident which he was, talking about. I had no idea what he was talking about. I didn't really remember his case. I didn't remember the incident. I asked him for a little more details. It still didn't ring a bell at all. This poor guy, because of his perfectionism and self-talk, lost sleep, built up this thing in his head that somehow he had looked bad in front of the court, that the court was frowning upon him, that the court was disappointed in him. And there wasn't a single shred of evidence, of foundational evidence to support any of those thoughts that he had. He basically wasted his time driving himself into a situation where he never needed to be. And, you know, so a lot of times, and I said to him, I said, I just want you to know something. You know, it's great that you felt, you want to improve on things that you feel, you know, self-constructiveness and stuff, but you didn't have to do it here. You reached a conclusion that had no basis in the first place because of your own self-doubt. You're doing a great job as an attorney. The times I've seen you in front of the court, you've done an excellent job. And all of a sudden he had this big smile on his face because he had this self-assurance or assurance from someone other than himself. That's what he needed, apparently. But the lesson in there, and I always carry that with me because, you know, we've all been guilty of that. I remember when I was a young attorney or young professional in different aspects of life, having similar self-doubt, similar feelings. And a lot of it is a complete fiction. And you can become a slave to that fiction. It can affect everything. Not only can you lose sleep, it can affect your own decision-making on future cases as they come up when you're filled with all of this self-doubt. It's very unhealthy. And what's it called? Minimizing and maximizing. When you maximize or over-embellish things which you did or you think you did to the point where now you build up a whole story. You create a fiction story. In this case, this fellow thought the court was very, very disappointed in him. There was no merit to it whatsoever. And then others are able to, and I think it comes with experience and time and maturity, are able to kind of accept the fact that you're going to say some things. Maybe sometimes you're going to say something that's going to offend a client in mediation or offend an opposing counsel or offend the court. Maybe that will happen. But even if it does, it's not the end of the world. We're all human. As I said at the outset, we're all human. The judges are human too, by the way. If you don't think that when the judges go out to lunch or when they're talking amongst themselves, that they're not talking about what they consider to be their own mistakes and wishes for do-overs and things like that, I can tell you that does happen because I was there for many years. It absolutely does happen. What we all have in common is we're all human beings, and the question is how we relate to mistakes and how we respond to mistakes. And if you respond in a constructive way and don't put too much pressure on yourself and give yourself an opportunity to be human and to be something less than perfect, in the long run, it's a much healthier, much more effective approach, in my view. Joan?
Well, that triggered two thoughts in my mind, and that's for my what if people. So how many times have you thought of something and responded to something that you thought was going to happen, but then it never happened? And that's where, once you're aware of that going on, because the brain really doesn't know the difference between what is real and what's not real. And that's why we can dream, wake up and think that it really did happen. So same thing happens when you're imagining, you know, what's going to happen in the future that may not. So that's where, again, learning about mindful meditation, which brings you back to here and now. What is happening and what is the facts? And not just running off of your beliefs of what you believe that's happening and then having such impulsive reactions and then becoming perseverative on it. And the other thing that triggered in my mind is that how many of us expect other people to know what we're thinking? And when we don't know what they're thinking, we're assuming that they know what we're thinking. We react to that. And we've even lost relationships over that sometimes. So in maintaining, you know, such relationships, again, that will go back to the skill of effective communication so that you can learn and be okay with what you are thinking and then take your thoughts and kind of imagine them in a book that you're holding down, you know, across your chest, and just put it down on the side. So when the other person is talking, you're not reacting personally or defensively or feel like you're being attacked. And this is part of effective listening so that you can have that, that conversation.
Right. As we kind of move towards the conclusion here, one of the other topics which we had on the flyer was reconsidering a recommendation on a pending case. And so this happens sometimes. Sometimes people, they perhaps gave a recommendation and then afterwards they kind of second guess that own recommendation. The question is, can you go back and say, well, you know, something I said, I want to change my mind on, or I'm looking at it a different way. And I really think it's important, again, keeping the humanistic approach to this whole thing, that if you really feel that you gave advice that upon further reflection or second thought that may need to be modified or altered a bit, there's no harm in doing that. Some people are afraid to admit they made a mistake, so to speak, or they feel it's going to somehow make them seem less than authoritative. But again, the role of a mediator is not to be authoritative, is to help people resolve cases. So if you have, let's say on Monday, you have a mediation and you were kind of leaning in one direction and facilitating in one direction, but then you thought about some other things you just didn't have enough time to think about during the session. I don't see there being a big problem in letting the parties know that upon further reflection, upon further thought, you might consider some other things here. That doesn't mean necessarily reversing yourself every 5 minutes or being wishy-washy every time you're in a mediation session. And of course, some mediators don't give any recommendations at all. They just facilitate. But other mediators who do give recommendations, there's no harm, quite frankly, if you've, upon legitimate follow-up thought, in letting people know that that perhaps you want to look at it with further reflection. In the court rules, judges are allowed to do that. They can make a decision and then reverse themselves within a reasonable time period for what's called a motion for reconsideration. That's what they call it, because in the course of human experience, people can reconsider things, can reevaluate things, etc. But once you've moved on and the case is over and closed and you're moving on to your next case, to let all the things of what you did in some prior case come back to haunt you or to self-haunt you is probably not going to be the most healthy thing to do from a mental health standpoint. The topic of this seminar is called Nobody's Perfect, and there's a book out. Has nothing to do with mediation. It has to do, I mentioned before, a baseball umpire. There was a baseball umpire named Jim Joyce who wrote a book called Nobody's Perfect, and he famously blew a call after having a great career as an umpire on the last out of a perfect game. A perfect game is when a pitcher gets everybody out. Nobody reaches first base. It almost never happens in baseball. It's happened maybe 20 or 30 times in 100 years. So some pitcher was throwing a perfect game, and on the very last batter, the batter hits a ground ball at the first. This Jim Joyce was the first base umpire, and he called the batter safe and blew the perfect game when he was clearly out. By all the replays, he was out. But the moral of the story is this. Jim Joyce, he came out and immediately, publicly said, I made a mistake. I feel terrible. I'm sorry. I'm not perfect. Nobody's perfect. I want to apologize for it. I just missed the call. He didn't try to defend it. He didn't try to set up some excuse like the sun was in his eyes or the videotape was wrong or whatever. He owned it. And so the next day, the umpire and everyone wanted to know, how was the pitcher going to react to this umpire for blowing his perfect game? And then on national TV, they came out to home plate for the next game and they hugged each other. And they wrote a book together, the pitcher and the umpire, called Nobody's Perfect. And the moral of the story is, it became a very positive thing to admit when you're human, to admit when you make an error, and to be able to move on from that rather than having it just eat you alive for the rest of your life or for two people's lives. Johnny?
Yes, there's an excellent question here where, they say they have some clients where they go from one unhappiness to another, and their expectation of their service provider tends to be unreasonable. What advice would you give a new mediator regarding these types of people? And this is exactly what I talked about with people having their own frame of references, their definitions, or what they're expecting. And I think Larry can expand upon this more because he wrote a whole thing about this, about preparing for mediation, how to prepare for mediation so that the clients do know what to expect, and define what compromise is all about, and define some of those emotions that somebody might have, that neither may walk away with total happiness. And that's what a compromise is really all about. Larry, would you like to expand upon that?
I think it's really helpful for a mediator, if you're taking on a new case, whether or not it has a whole back history of a lot of disputes, whether they've been to 12 mediators previously or not, it's always helpful to set right up front in mediation what the reasonable expectations of the parties can and cannot be, which generally means in the course of a mediation that, number one, most cases do settle. They do. Statistically, they do. Number two, they don't settle because one side realizes or recognizes how right the other side is. That almost never happens, quite frankly, in my experience anyway. They settle because it's in someone's best interest, in both parties' best interest to settle, whether it's a civil case or a family case, or really any kind of case. you save money, you save time, and most importantly, you have control of the outcome. You participate in the outcome. And I try to point out to litigants at the start of mediation what makes for a failed mediation, in my experience, which almost always involves one side or the other being disrespectful to the other party, disrespectful to the process, which means that it's not a time or a place to try your case, so to speak. It's a time to talk in a respectful manner about different constructive ways how to resolve this in a confidential way, which does not get repeated in court in the event the case is not settled. And that there's not to be any raised voices and not to be any disrespectful gestures. There's not to be any storming out. If somebody's going to do that, they're going to know up front that that violates the rules and structure of the mediation. I ask both parties, do you understand the rules and are you willing to abide by them? And each side will almost always say yes. So that way, and usually when you're in mediation, well, I can say usually, but very often it becomes an emotional thing. There's triggers, use the word we used before, which come about. One party says something that triggers something with the other. And sometimes, you know, start to kind of go off track a little bit. So you can bring them back by saying, remember at the beginning what you both agreed to. You're going to handle this in a respectful way. You are not going to let whatever happened in the past get in the way of the productivity of today's proceeding. And you're going to handle this in a respectful fashion. So when you say that, most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time people understand that and can be brought back to what they previously committed to, as opposed to just running out the door. But what it also does is it helps the mediator, because then you don't, if in fact it falls apart, if in fact one side or the other storms out or says, I'm not listening, you can go home at night and say to yourself, listen, I did what I was supposed to do. I instructed them very clearly about how mediation is supposed to work. I asked if they were willing to participate in this fashion. They both said yes. If they broke the rules, if they went rogue on the whole situation, it's not anything that I did wrong. It's they just chose to go in that direction. And so you can second guess yourself all you want, but you really handled it in an appropriate fashion by letting people know through the beginning, it's the educational component, the beginning of the mediation, what to expect and what not to expect, and to get that commitment from them accordingly. Yeah.
And I also think that it's important that if you put down the ground rules or what is expected, you know, in an effective mediation, and you have a written list of that and you have that present. Yeah. When somebody does break it, you show it as the rules and not like this is what you did. Because when people feel like they're being personally attacked and they're put on the defensive, it's going to make everything, you know, fall apart.
Right. And most importantly, I know we're down to the last 2 minutes here. Most importantly, I think if what makes for a successful mediation, we say nobody's perfect, as long as you let the mediators feel, not just through words, but through actions, that you are impartial, that you're listening to both sides, that you're not giving one side, if an hour session, 45 minutes to talk and the other side is 15 minutes and everyone's watching the clock. How can you listen more to him or her than to me? That type of thing. As long as you are as perfectly balanced as possible and neutral as possible, you're doing your job. And there's going to be things which come about where, you know, things are going to be said which are going to possibly get you upset, possibly get you angry. But you got to have a little bit of an iron stomach in this field. I mean, you just do. And you have to anticipate that these things are going to come about. And as long as you keep your composure and as long as you keep your professionalism, you're doing the best you can do. Nobody has to be perfect, whatever that means. I don't know what perfect would even mean in the context of mediation, but as long as you're doing what you need to do to maintain that neutrality and give the parties an opportunity to try to resolve the case in a mutually fair manner with your assistance, then you're doing your job and you can sleep well at night regardless of whether the case ultimately settled or not. Joni?
And talking about sleeping well at night, for my people who are having sleep disturbances, I would recommend decreasing stimulation from white lights or the TV, the cell phones, you know, because and also the computers, because we really want to promote a good restful or REM sleep. You might want to take a relaxing bath or shower. Again, smells become very important, as do temperature regulation. So if you need to use aromatherapy or put on a fan or a heater, and then manage any underlying conditions. You breathe through the calm, you reframe the thoughts, you hydrate, you think of those pleasant thoughts, and then when you get out of bed in the morning, stretch before you rise, and then start your new day. There's
one quick question here. It says, what opportunities are there for co-mediation? Are these set up by the novice mediator primarily? Certainly a mediator can contact other mediators and ask, but I believe this would be a very appropriate subject for discussion on the panel board with through APM. I think that there are opportunities, I don't know them off the top of my head, for co-mediations to be set up, but they do have a chat board, and I think that could be developed through there. Yes, I see right here, Andrew just sent a text saying NJAPA has an apprentice program. So if you're interested in co-mediating, I believe you can contact NJAPM and they can give you some more information about that. And again, as I said earlier, I strongly recommend it. I want to thank New Jersey APM for having us up here today. And it was a lot of fun. Hopefully you found this to be enlightening and helpful in some fashion. If you have any questions, you can certainly contact us. And Joni, anything for closing remarks?
Just thank you and have a pleasant day.
Have a very good summer too. Thank you.